Well, everyone, good to have you tonight. Michael Beck here. Welcome to the lecture. I'm going to jump right in here. Um, and our topic tonight is mapping the metrics, rethinking vitality in a post-Christendom age. It's a topic that's very fresh for me right now and that I'm very excited about. So I'm grateful to kind of share some of the emerging stuff that's happening. Um, I'm going to start with a little story of when the numbers don't add up. And I remember sitting in an annual evaluation committee that we Methodists do, and I had my group of people that most of leadership I had inherited from a new appointment at a particular church. And they were doing my evaluation and they were looking at the metrics, the vitality measures that we use to determine whether I was a good pastor or not a good pastor. And going by the data that was there, we had a slight little increase, a couple growth and a little bit of worship attendance, and our finances were not declining, but they weren't growing either. And so they were concerned about that. Needless to say, my evaluation wasn't great. And they told me that I needed to focus more on helping the church become vital again. And what they meant by that was like growing the membership, growing the money, in all of those ways that our metrics program us to think about vitality. Now, what they didn't measure though was that we had spent about 2 years doing deep listening in the community, forming teams with people outside the church, starting some fresh expressions. We had a tattoo parlor church going on, one of the oldest fresh expressions in Florida and in the United States. We had Burritos and Bibles was starting up. We had some stuff we were doing in the MLK called the Connect. Now we were doing some, today we would call it anti-racism movement in a very racist, segregationist kind of town, and the church having a role in that actually. So we were doing marches and we have been in the newspaper and on TV 20 about this stuff we were doing to challenge racism. Those were all things I was very excited about. I was watching people who had never gone to church or have at least not been to church in a very long time. And they were connecting in these fresh expressions of church and growing in their faith. And so I was super excited about all of that. But none of that showed up on the spreadsheet, and none of that showed up on their definition of vitality, what they were looking for me from me as a pastor. So they thought I needed to stop some of those activities I was engaged with a couple church members and mostly community people, and I needed to more focus on making the church vital again. And what I realized in that moment is that we really had two totally different ideas of vitality. Now, I grew up in a congregation when I was a kid. My life took a detour, and I was totally removed from the church for a great period of my young adulthood. Came back, so I was not a church going, camp attending Methodist. I don't tell anybody this, but I only read the Book of Discipline just to get through the ordination process. I'm not a person I frankly don't care a lot about those processes and hierarchies and all of those things. My calling is to reach people that are currently neglected or harmed by the church, and to care for the existing church and empower them to reach those people together as a team. So I didn't really think much about those other metrics, and they weren't on my mind for what vitality looks like. They weren't in the scripture. They weren't what Jesus was doing. So we just had these conflicting versions of what vitality looks like. So if you were to look at that church today just by the spreadsheet for the metrics, right, for the worship service and the giving, and it wouldn't have measured the tattoo parlor church. It wouldn't have measured Connect that we were doing in the MLK. It wouldn't have measured the social impact we were having and the partnerships we were building, the community partnerships. It wouldn't have measured the new worship experience that we were kind of percolating, starting with some people mostly outside the church. It wouldn't have measured the growth in the healing of racism and segregation in our town, or the churches working together to do these revivals and these marches. It wouldn't have measured people who would never come to our church on a Sunday morning, but they were gathering in that tattoo parlor. They were gathering in that burrito place. They were gathering in the MLK, and the integration that was happening through those ministries with our community. Wouldn't measure any of that, right? So our spreadsheets, our data, our metrics don't tell the whole story. And this is not something unique to me. Can I get an amen from any leaders, pastors that are in the house, right? This is something that, and I started to hear this all across with everybody that I knew, that this was a recurring thing. It was a known thing. And people have been thinking about metrics and doing different metrics for decades, not really making a whole lot of headway. I took a shot and created a little paper called the Missional Metrics for a Blended Ecology of Church. 10 years ago, I wrote that paper, a white paper, and I sent it out to some bishops and some influencers and some seminary professors, and they were all like, yes, we get it. And I realized at that time that if we didn't measure fresh expressions, if we didn't count them as part of our ecosystem of church, that and eventually the institution would either kind of dampen, put a lid on, or exile the fresh expressions movement. And so way back in the genesis of my involvement with fresh expressions, we were trying to lobby for those different metrics. And today it seems like there's a fresh conversation happening, because if you looked at a graph like this, and we've looked at this before, you would say, church attendance not great. In Europe it's 14%, in the US it's 25%, and we're catching up quickly, the United States to Europe. And the things that people are attending are not necessarily Christianity. They're distortions of Christianity. There's people showing up for Christian nationalism. There's people showing up for like a Jesus-less progressive form of Christianity, but they're attending that regularly. So this data doesn't really give us the whole picture if we're just looking at attendance. For example, if you think about the Florida conference, where we have been pretty intentional about the Fresh Expressions movement for over 10 years now, we have districts, and we have cultivators of those districts that are doing district-based fresh expressions, and they're supporting the local work of fresh expressions that are happening. We have 6 cultivators. Those people are coaching, equipping churches and laity, and it's bringing alongside the institutional, hierarchical kind of structure, this kind of collaborative, decentralized, distributed, networked kind of ecclesiology beside that, and what we call a blended ecology. So there's 200 plus documented fresh expressions, and that's just the people we can get to actually fill out the report. And I'm going to be honest, I'm one of those people that doesn't actually fill out the report. So I'm throwing a little shade at myself here, but we're learning about these communities all over the place. So if you only looked at the inherited metrics that we currently use, you would not have a full picture of what's going on in local churches in Florida or in many other places that are experimenting with all kinds of things like fresh expressions and things like it. So I'm really excited that through Discipleship Ministries and Path One, we've been putting together this missional metrics cohort, and we had incredible response to it. 39 conferences joined into it. And this is a bunch of people that are saying, hey, look, we know we need new metrics. We've been saying it for a long time. So let's actually come together and do something about it. Let's, take all the best thinking around this and get together and experiment and do some things. So my primary focus with this missional metrics cohort, along with, just being part of it and supporting it however I can, was to do some research out of it. So I'm at the University of Florida in the sociology department. I'm a graduate instructor in sociology, and I'm doing some research there alongside my mentor, Monica Ardell. And the first wave of my research is a little report called the Mapping the Metrics report. And so what I'm doing is analyzing content analysis on the current metrics that are used in the United Methodist Church. So pulling all the different ways that we measure vitality across the connection in the United States, but then also alongside that content analysis, I'm doing focus group research, qualitative data, where I'm interviewing people in these focus groups and asking a series of questions to get their thoughts about the metrics, to understand how they measure vitality in their different contexts. What they see as the benefits, positives, negatives of those metrics, and what they would suggest are the gaps in those metrics, and what they would suggest for new metrics, and if they could dream up and imagine metrics. So you can see kind of the details of the sample here. It was a pretty good sample. We had a good representation in multiple ways. This gives you just kind of some of the details of what the demographic looked like, and fairly typical actually of United Methodism in the United States, the age distribution, the roles. So we had developers, clergy, and laity. We had them in distinct groups and then interviewed them apart. So laity with laity, developers with developers, conference staff, clergy with clergy. And we had a pretty good sampling across the whole United States, from the West Coast to the East Coast and several places in between, and even a little bit of as much as you can say in the Methodist Church that we have racial and ethnic diversity, we did have that in the sample. Across the board, those people that were part of this first focus group said that the current vitality metrics are inadequate, and many describe them actually as harmful. There was not a single person in the sample that made a case that the metrics we have currently are good or that actually measure vitality. Not a single person. Some of them were supportive of the current metrics that we had, but also saying they're not enough. We need a lot more. And so the idea that attendance and giving and membership, people called them reductionist and outdated, spiritually shallow. They distort behavior in burden clergy. They fail to capture what's actually happening in congregational life, such as spiritual transformation and justice and resilience and community relationships. All those things that I talked about that wasn't on my clergy evaluation every year. I'm doing a lot with, there's a thing called indicator theory, and Sally Mary Engel is the scholar who wrote a book called, or several report research called Measuring the World. And so we have indicator theory, and I'm going to get into a little bit about that idea of the importance of indicators and how we measure stuff and why that matters. So the folks started to share as they got into the sequence of questions around what actually is vitality, define that. Across laity, clergy, and the developers, there was some things that kind of had some synergy. And Christ-like communities, or like a Christ-like character, or the way and truth and life of Jesus, and people growing in that was a definition that people had. Growing in holy love, the word compassion was used. Love for God, love for neighbor. Emotional maturity would be what a vital community looks like, where the people that are part of this ecosystem are grounded in holy love, where they're emotionally mature. Adaptability, not stuck in this rigid kind of thinking. Local mission was a big commitment of folks when they thought about vitality, and community engagement, social capital, those kind of things. And there was a lot named about vital congregations aren't always growing in numbers, but they're growing in faithfulness and compassion and community impact. I'll never forget a story. One of the participants shared about his church not growing by the standard metrics, but that he had done numerous funerals over the last couple of years, and that the community saw him as the person to come to in the time of grief, to console families and to help nurture them through the time of death, some of the most significant traumatic thing that a human goes through, right? And that his church had a lot of funerals, a lot of deaths, as Lovett Weems talked about years ago in his book, Focus, the death tsunami that's coming for the mainline denominations, because our congregations are primarily made up of the builder generation, but that he would grow through new people would come in. But if you looked at like his average worship attendance, it was flatlined because so many people were dying. And even though they were actually adding new people, that wasn't showing up in the reporting. And the faithful act of caring for people in their moment of grief, doing good funerals, right, is not on the reporting. That's not considered vital in our current indicators. So people were across the board pretty overall understanding that the current metrics don't actually measure vitality in the deepest way that it could. So what we measure, we become. So if you look at Sally Mary Engel's work, you start to see that indicators are not neutral. They actually program the behavior in the social system. What we measure, people behave in ways, if this is defined as success, or this is defined as failure, or this is defined as whatever, they behave in ways that they feel like the system will reward the right behavior. And indicators can also discourage other behaviors, right? So what we measure, we become. For better or worse, our metrics actually shape our culture. They shape even our conceptions of vitality. One of the things that came out of the study that somebody said, they were talking about how pastors, clergy inflate their numbers. And then a layperson in the focus group said, well, isn't it sad that we've created a social system? They didn't use that language, but that we have a church where pastors feel like they have to inflate their numbers, right? And my little sociologist heart was doing cartwheels and flips, because she was naming like the sociological imagination, saying there's people have free will and their behaviors are determined genetically, DNA, all those things, but our behaviors are also programmed socially, right? And when you have a metric system that pushes you towards having these numbers all up and to the right, it can actually discourage honesty. It can encourage dishonesty, inflating numbers. You know, we all joke about, oh, the clergy numbers. And that's actually not good, because we have a situation where our society largely distrusts clergy. And so we should be known as people of integrity and ultimate honesty and all those things. And so the social system, these indicators, can push people toward trying to inflate those. And what we measure shapes what we become. So the current systems incentivize things like institutional preservation, who can politic in the institution, who can climb the ladder and do the things that are perceived as successful. Comparison is a big thing. Look at, you know, what clergy get together, maybe lady do this, I don't know, and they say, so what you running on a Sunday, or how big's your church? And then you know, evaluate each other based on that. Fear, right? When you see, I'm tanking, like these numbers not good, everything's not up and to the right, right? And so then that, oh, we dying, and fear, anxiety, it creates this cycle. And all of that neglects the slower, deeper work of relational discipleship and incarnational mission and spiritual health. And so the system actually programs our churches for maintenance, not mission. I have a Substack post on this in a little podcast episode on Compassion Matters, that maintenance is not the mission, but our metrics program is for that. So this is not just that we need a technical shift. It's not technical problem, technical solution. This is an adaptive challenge. I've talked about this numerous times in previous lectures, but it's also a theological and a cultural shift that we have to go through if we're going to get to metrics that actually measure vitality. So we can't just tweak the spreadsheets. It's about realigning our evaluation with our Wesleyan theology, or whatever theological system you're coming from, that your metrics are grounded in the commitments of that theological system and the mission of that system. So for us to make disciples of Jesus Christ for the transformation of the world, you know, we took the go off, which explains a lot of why we are where we are, because it's all about come to us, come do our programs, come put your butt in our pew. Our mission statement is actually to go out into the world and form people in the way and truth and life of Jesus. And by doing that, we'll transfigure the world. And do our metrics get at that and assess that we're completing our mission? Metrics should not be used for surveillance. This was a thing that came up a lot. Like, people just said, metrics just feel like surveillance. I feel like people are watching me. I don't know what they do with the data either. We had several developers, DSs, just be really transparent and say, and I actually don't look at those reports when I make decisions about appointments or churches, or because I know that they're inaccurate. And, you know, so we collect all this data, this counting data, and nobody really knows what happens with it. It feels like, you know, Big Brother's watching you. Churches have to fill these reports and they agonize about it every year, and clergy agonize about it. But like, it's a surveillance system, like watching over us. And we need metrics that get at coaching and formation and mutual accountability. Yes, you want to have some accountability in your system, and metrics can provide that. But you don't want to create a surveillance system where there's anxiety and fear, and, you know, but we can have learning metrics, which I'm going to get to. So learning metrics. There's a situation in the Old Testament where David decides to take a census, right? This is found in 2 Samuel 24:10. and he takes the census, and I love Eugene Peterson's message version of this. And he counts the people, and he replaced trust with statistics. I'm in a lot of conversations with a lot of different groups of people and denominations and seminaries and whatever. And it really does feel like we've replaced trust in the Holy Spirit with the statistics. And we assess our health and our power and our strength by our statistics rather than the power of the Holy Spirit. Now, I'm a statistics guy. I collect quantitative and qualitative data. I love data. David wanted good data. Who can blame the guy for that? There's not a problem with collecting good data, right? Social science is here. The problem is when you worship the data, or where you put your trust in the data, or you supplement your trust in God, you replace your trust in God with the data. And David realizes this, right? And he says, oh, I've sinned badly in what I've done. God, forgive my guilt. I've been really stupid. And I wonder if denominationally we're in a place where we need to repent and say, maybe God, we have maybe replaced trust in you with our statistics, and we repent. We need to turn around and go the other direction. So some of our current challenges is a structural mismatch. So denominations are just modeled after this managerial age assumptions, right? So you talk about churches like they're corporations and businesses, and you have these managerial, committees structured after the 20th century corporation. And we're now in a 21st century network society, to use Manuel Castell's language. And we're still programming and acting and behaving and measuring in the managerial era. And we're in a network society that's people are connected through digital technology, through flows that gather in nodes and hubs around practices. So the social structure of society has transformed, and we're stuck in a mismatch denominationally. We're still structured in the old social system, right? And one of the genius things, for example, of early Methodism is it adapted its structure to the emerging industrial age revolution that was happening, and took it to the fields and created societies, classes, bands, and adapted to the emerging social structure. Another challenge is our leadership pipeline fragility. Honestly, there's just a lot of young people not signing up to become clergy anymore. We have people we invest in, they're part of our churches, they're part of our system. And then if they do pursue ministry, they go other places because they're not finding the mainline pipeline to be the way that they can express their calling, or maybe don't want to sign up for that full package, what that looks like. And we have a membership based institution, and we're in a post-membership, people not becoming members of things society. So to be in a leadership position in my church, you're supposed to have been a member for such a period of time. And if you want to go into ministry, you have to have a track record of being a member of that. People, and a lot of our fresh expressions, never technically become a member in the way of, do a class, come down to the altar, sign a paper, right? So there's a pipeline breakdown. And then entrepreneurial people that use an effectual reasoning process, or people that say, hey, I want to be in ministry. I want to start a fresh expression, maybe pastor like a network of churches, but I don't want to be like a spiritual butler of, the on-call spiritual butler of an inherited thing. And so we say, well, if you can't do that, you're kind of out. You got to do that. So we're just exiling those people. We have a kind of a clergy caste system where we talk about lay empowerment, but there's really a glass ceiling for laity, what they can do and what they can't do. And a lot of lay people live in a state of learned helplessness, where they're not really bringing their gifts and their graces in the way that they could, because simply our system discourages laity from doing certain things. And one of the beauties of fresh expressions, it actually unleashes, empowers laity to start churches. There's communication gaps between the center and the edge with the fresh expressions movement. So the center has its own way of communicating and its own political systems and its own hierarchy. And these edge stuff, the center doesn't always understand the edge, and the edge is kind of sometimes rebellious against the center. You need both, right? You need Jerusalem, you need Antioch together, but we don't always do that well. And denominational agency competition. So like in my world, in the United Methodist Church, we have agencies that were funded by apportionment dollars, big, robust institutional agencies that as things dry up, if we're just relying on the plate donation system and apportionments and that old way of doing things, those agencies are losing funding, they're losing strength and relevance. And so rather than, collaborating and adapting, we're just kind of doubling down into each our little thing that we do. And I'm throwing rocks at myself there as a person who's part of an agency. And there's a misunderstanding about fresh expressions. Some people think it's just as trying to replace the inherited church. It's not. It is an ecology of church with inherited and fresh expressions together. Other people who are opposed to evangelism say, well, I'm not going to do that because it's illegal to do evangelism or something. Other people just don't think it's actually it'll never result in those things. In every church my wife and I have led, we've revitalized the inherited church by doing fresh expressions. Creating church with people outside the church has a lot of implications for the inherited church. And while we don't go out and do fresh expression and try to bait and switch people back to the inherited church, people naturally make that journey for themselves a lot of times. And it helps the inherited church adopt a new culture where they're thinking missionally, where lay people are enabled as priests. They're on the preaching team. We're doing everything differently because the fresh expressions in systems thinking has become a strange attractor that draws the whole system in a new direction. But people don't understand any of that. They just think it's a fad or something that I'm not going to waste my time on because it's not going to really help my inherited church. It's a fatal mistake for a lot of churches. And it doesn't have to be fresh expressions. You don't have to use that language, but the idea of forming communal life in Jesus with people outside the church in whatever way or language that's appropriate. There's a lot of institutional mistrust. So the reason that we have one of the most spiritually open sequence of age cohorts, and yet they're completely opposed to the institutional iterations of the church, mistrust, all those things. We're in a kind of a post-membership, post-institutional culture, and people just don't trust those institutions, right? Like clergy no longer at the top of the trusted professions list. We're down there with chiropractors. Chiropractors are more trusted than clergy in the 21st century. There's a study on it. And we're right down there with lawyers and politicians. So not great for those of us who are clergy. So that whole thing, people don't want to be a part of that kind of an institution. So, and there's a need for soul care and sustainable rhythms. A lot of entrepreneurial type leaders, lay and clergy, have this kind of drivenness, this entrepreneurial spirit, this risk-taking adventure thing. And we have to work really hard to balance that with Sabbath and doing things for our own emotional life and spiritual growth. So you may have noticed over the last couple of weeks, there's been a lot of things blowing up in the sky and dissembling. There's people who are very committed to become a multi-planetary species, and believe that the first step of that is to colonize Mars with a permanent colony. So the people that are in that camp know if we're going to colonize Mars, if we're going to become an interplanetary people, that we have to figure out rocket propulsion that can take people, technology, resources to another planet so we can establish that colony. And then that can be a base, a jump off point to do that again. A lot of people that are in the camp that this is like the most essential mission that human beings could be involved in the 21st century, see the climate crisis, they see the escalation of global war and discussions around now nuclear war, and we're having bombing people in our current situation. There's civil unrest, people marching in the streets. The earth itself is going through radical climate changes all the time. Storms are getting worse every year. So we're in a very vulnerable situation right now. And so for those folks, this mission to get to Mars is really important because it'll create resilience for the human race. And so getting rockets up in the air is important. Now, have you noticed when a rocket blows up, there's a technical term for that: rapid unscheduled disassembly. I love that language. When we see a rocket blow up, we go, oh, disaster, that's terrible. When an engineer or people that are involved in these rocket creation companies trying to get to Mars see that, they see it as a rapid unscheduled disassembly. They see it as a data collection point. What went wrong? What can we learn? Why did it blow up? Where was the failure, right? Rather than seeing it as disasters, like it's part of the process. Fail early, fail quick, learn fast. Now, I wonder if the church could maybe take some of this as we think about metrics, as we think about how we think about vitality. Is it not important that we kind of take on a little bit of that posture of failing fast, learning fast, and that we're going to experience rapid unscheduled assembly? And when we talk about a metrics conversation, that's important because most of our metrics, some would argue against this, but are counting metrics. So that's measuring attendance, giving, tell us what happened. They reinforce institutional success. They focus on control, evaluate growth, reflection stories. Learning metrics are ask, what did we try? What was learned by that? What does that reveal about God? Learning metrics encourage curiosity and change. They embrace risk. We know we're going to fail. In Fresh Expressions, we know most of the stuff we start, most of the communities we are part of aren't going to make it, right? And so there's this iterative, experimental. We know we're going to experience rapid, unscheduled disassembly. We know that, and it's baked into the process. But all of our metrics currently discourage that learning fail. Saint within hours denies Jesus 3 times, right? Utterly fails his courage, his faith, everything. Jesus comes, reinstates him. So his failure was part of his formation, right? That made him the person that he was. And the whole book of Acts is about the church not getting it right, not doing everything according to plan, failing forward, the Spirit intervening, the Spirit leaning, the Spirit challenging their ethnocentrism and their reforming them in structures, and Acts 10 and Acts 15, the Jerusalem Council making some major kind of changes. So we need learning metrics that encourage that kind of failing mentality, knowing that we're going to experience rapid unscheduled disassembly. So what's emerging in the conversation right now is adaptable tools that are actively learning, discipleship markers, vitality markers that get at this, that we need to celebrate the faithfulness of churches, whether they're a small little Fresh Expression, a rural congregation doing lots of funerals, a big mega church with lots of people coming, that faithfulness doesn't necessarily, size does not demonstrate faithfulness. That's just a fallacy. I've been a part of some large churches, and I was on the staff of some large churches that were not healthy. But they were big, and by all the metric reports, they were vital. Making data a spiritual practice in this way is about learning metrics, right? The practice of getting that data and learning, not idolizing data like what David did when he did his census. And so we need the ground metrics and transformation and change, and not metrics that keep us stuck or try to call us back to the 1950s, but that are moving us forward into whatever vitality is going to look like. And that gives us a way to create just-in-time resources that support the experimentation based on those metrics. And we can utilize technology to track and analyze spiritual growth. Just think of the way that you track your health, right? On your watch or now on your glasses, that you can get a whole metric report, right? Of your heart rate, your sleep ability, or how many steps you took, how you ate, all of that can be tracked in a little data tracker. Your physical health. What if there's ways we can track that around our spiritual health? And now we have AI that we can have a million minds thinking about something in a flash of a second. We can take that data and we can find creative ways to analyze it quickly using that technology, right? And be able to get a big group of people and really analyze that data, like spiritual growth and discipleship and Fresh Expression formation. So utilizing technology to do that, adapting from the hierarchical centralized structures for relational, decentralized networks, both and. We still need our hierarchies, we still need our center, we still need our Jerusalem, but we also need Antioch, and the new metrics have to pick up both and, the fresh expressions and the inherited, or we're just going to be having conversations like I was 15 years ago with that church who's saying, you're not doing great, right? We want to see our church vital again. What about all this stuff over here? We don't care. Like, we want to see butts and pews, right? So reorganizing theological education and training around entrepreneurial adventure ministry is really important right now. What are we going to do with these people we're hemorrhaging that don't want to take the traditional pathway in ministry and didn't grow up going to church camp and are not part of the family nepotism of annual conferences and all those things? So theological education has to get behind and support and do deep research and theological validation, exploration of these new kind of forms of church, new economic models that support this. We have to think about how we measure that. Space usage, the days of churches just having the big complex that they only use for 2 hours a week is just not great stewardship. There's people that are experiencing homelessness. There's groups that could use our space. There's young entrepreneurs that need free Wi-Fi. There's children and youth in our community that need spaces to do their sports. Space usage, we can't just have these dedicated spaces in most contexts just for the churchy stuff. And embracing bi and co and transvocational ministry. I'll talk more about that in a later lecture, but bi being two-ness, right? I have a job and I do church, pastor, co-witness, co-vocational, so my job is with my work, my entrepreneurial adventures or whatever, our church. And then transvocational is a transfiguration where we want to take people who have a previous career and put them through a sausage maker and say, leave that career behind and just come do ministry. But what if we can have pastors that are also lawyers for their day job and clergy who also run businesses? And what about clergy who've had significant training, education, can't provide for their families with what a church can pay them and are now have loads of educational debt? What if they were freed to use all of that to teach in other places or to create businesses or whatever? And then lay empowerment is a huge part of this conversation. So holy experimentation, it normalizes failure as part of innovation. It fosters bold contextual approaches to church. It honors spiritual growth over institutional maintenance. Those don't have to be mutually exclusive. If you have people that are growing spiritually, the institution is going to do better, but sometimes we prioritize institutional maintenance to the exclusion of spiritual growth. A center that learns from the edge, where the center is not just thinking we hold all the wisdom and the power, we're like a hub and we'll send it out to spokes because we know all the wisdom and the knowledge. Rather, we flip that and the center comes out to the edge to learn, right, and become a learning organization again. And we have to move from self-preservation to self-donation. Self-preservation, the way that of Jesus, of the way of institutions where we double down, we hold on to it. Self-donation, opening our hands, giving away what we have, dying to self. So part of this is like new mental models. The struggle for the old mental models win out over the new mental models. We're fighting against culture here, and culture, strategy. Culture eats strategy for breakfast. So having shared meanings and values in culture, becoming a learning organization is really important. So continual growth and adaptation, and having learning metrics that I just talked about at length that require reflection and evaluation. So if you think about this illustration, a wink is not a blink, right? So when you blink, it's a non-voluntary usually response that your eyes do, right? Similar mechanics as a wink, but a wink is a way that you're signaling something, right? You're communicating something, and that is culturally or contextually determined. Two different mechanics that you do with your eyes, right? But two totally different things that have two totally different meanings. And if we're going to change culture, we're going to change metrics. We can't just change the spreadsheet without changing the story. And you can't change the story without changing the spreadsheet. So we're stuck in this kind of conundrum. And sociologists who study culture and talk about thick description and webs of meaning think about these things. and that we have to think about the cultural ways that we think about vitality in different contexts. That's determined contextually, not some generic thing we can put over everything and say, this is what vitality looks like. I've suggested over my time here, so I'm going to wrap this up, that metrics, we could use the Fresh Expressions framework, the listening, loving, building community, exploring discipleship church, as a new framework for metrics. So measuring how churches are listening, what kind of time they spend in key locations and for engagement. What are we learning from our listening? Building metrics around that stage, loving and serving. How will we understand and serve the passion, dreams, needs of its neighbors? What are the assets in our community? What are the names of individuals and groups? How are we tracking those authentic needs? Building community metrics that get at that phase of the development. How many regular attendees are showing up? Are they showing vulnerability and connection and growing spiritually? Exploring discipleship. What does that look like contextually in the lives of the people that are participating in these communities? Are they going deeper with their discipleship? Church taking shape. These are where we start to say, is communion starting to take place, or baptism, or all of these different things that we would think about as vitality in a normal church. The last thing I'm going to share is about wisdom as a metric for vitality. And it's interesting, in the Old Testament, you have this passage about God giving Solomon wisdom, the deepest of understanding and the largest of hearts. There's my mentor, Dr. Ardelt, has this 3-dimensional scale for wisdom that aligns perfectly with the biblical definition of wisdom. So there's a cognitive dimension of wisdom. That's about having deep understanding, recognizing the uncertainty, paradox. So wise people know stuff, right? Wise people are reflective. Wise people, communities, congregations, organizations, they take perspective, they're self-aware, they see their part in things, and they're able to distinguish that. There's an absence of kind of self-centeredness, and wise people are compassionate, right? So wise people are emotionally, morally, they care, they have empathetic concern and love for others. So if you look at that, Solomon's description of Solomon's wisdom, so when Solomon asked God to, bless him as the new ruler, the new king, he asked for this wisdom. So you have chokmah, wisdom. So that's that practical, ethical, spiritual discernment, skillful living, moral. That's the cognitive dimension, right? It also says that he had tabanua, or he had understanding or discernment. So he had reflective, perception, moral reasoning, the ability to distinguish right and wrong. So that self-reflective thing, that's the reflective dimension of wisdom. And then he had rachav lev, so breadth of heart, emotional depth, empathy, moral courage, openness to others. That's that compassion and dimension. So it's interesting, we have this modern concept of wisdom in the 21st century that we've done a lot of research and study on. And then you have the very same biblical, you could basically lay the two over, the concept of biblical wisdom. And what I suspect we're missing most of all in the church and in our world and in communities is we lack this kind of wisdom. We may be super smart, have lots of intelligence, high IQs, lots of technology, but the wisdom to discern, to be reflective, to care, to be compassionate, those things are typically missing. And are our congregations forming people in that kind of wisdom? Are they becoming more wise people through participating in the congregation? Are we forming people to know the biblical stuff? Yes, but also to be self-reflective, Christ-like, and compassionate in their dealings. And I wonder if there's maybe that we have to integrate wisdom into how we think about our metrics, and then maybe there's a way that we can think about congregational wisdom, which I'm going to come back to in the next lecture. So now is the time to fire away with all your questions, and I thank you for being part of this lecture.